The villagers of Blackwood Valley still speak of it in hushed tones. How the ground trembled that night as mountains crumbled. How 43 lives hung in the balance until salvation came from an impossible source. A beast so massive its shadow could engulf a man. A creature with eyes reflecting not animal instinct, but calculated purpose. They speak of Eleanor Thornfield's bear. No ordinary widow, no ordinary bear. When authorities broke into Eleanor's isolated cabin after her death, they discovered journals documenting something beyond comprehension. Formulas scribbled in margins. Audio recordings capturing sounds no bear should make. Missing scientists' identifications tucked between pages. For decades, they dismissed her as the crazy bear lady living in the hills. Even when reports surfaced of a bear standing upright at nearly 9 feet tall, watching the village through the fog. Even when children insisted it had saved them from the abandoned mine collapse. Even when hunters who pursued it never returned. What Eleanor Thornfield had created in that cabin remained hidden until her death. What emerged afterward defied scientific understanding. The military wanted it. Pharmaceutical companies hunted it. The village needed it. And somewhere in the ancient forest, it waited, planning, remembering, evolving. The silence of Blackwood Valley was broken only by the occasional creak of Eleanor Thornfield's rocking chair as it swayed back and forth on the weathered porch of her cabin. At 78 years old, her once auburn hair had faded to silver, and deep lines mapped her face like the trails she had walked all her life in these remote mountains. Her eyes, still sharp and clear blue, gazed out at the vast wilderness surrounding her home, a place most considered too isolated to live in, especially for someone her age. For nearly 50 years, Eleanor had called this remote cabin home. She and her husband Samuel had built it together with their own hands, dreaming of a quiet life away from the noise and complications of the modern world. They had been happy here, content in their solitude. The locals in the small town 30 miles away barely knew them, just the odd couple who came in for supplies once a month and kept to themselves. When Samuel passed away 5 winters ago, everyone expected Eleanor to move into town. No one believed she could survive alone up in these mountains. The cabin was too remote, the winters too harsh, the wildlife too dangerous. But Eleanor Thornfield was not a woman who bent to others' expectations. Samuel was buried on their land, beneath the ancient oak tree where they had shared so many summer picnics. She would not leave him. The grief had nearly swallowed her whole that first year. The silence that once felt peaceful now echoed with emptiness. She talked to Samuel as if he were still there, setting his plate at dinner, telling him about the changing seasons, asking questions that would never receive answers. The cabin that had once felt just right for 2 now seemed cavernous for 1. Eleanor established new routines. Each morning she tended her vegetable garden, the one that provided most of her food. Afternoons were spent collecting firewood, preserving foods for winter, or mending what needed repair around the property. In the evenings, she read books by lamplight, her collection vast and well-worn. Once a month, she made the journey into town for supplies she could not produce herself. The townspeople watched her with a mixture of pity and awe, wondering how long the old widow could maintain this lifestyle. As the years passed, her trips to town became less frequent. She became more self-sufficient, or perhaps just more determined to avoid human contact. The whispers grew. Some called her the mountain witch, others the crazy widow. Children dared each other to venture near her property, but few ever did. Rumors spread that she practiced strange rituals in the woods. In truth, she was simply a woman who preferred the company of nature to that of people who did not understand her choice to remain in the place she loved. This particular winter was different. Even Eleanor, with her decades of experience in these mountains, had never seen anything like it. The snowfall began in late October, weeks earlier than usual, and continued with relentless fury. By December, drifts reached the windowsills of her cabin. The temperature plummeted to levels that made the wood of her cabin contract and groan in protest. Game became scarce. The paths to town disappeared beneath blankets of white so deep that even her snowshoes could not manage them. For the first time since Samuel's death, Eleanor felt fear creeping into her bones, colder than the air that seeped through the cabin walls. Her supplies were dwindling faster than anticipated. The firewood she had stockpiled, usually enough to last the season, was diminishing at an alarming rate as she fought to keep the biting cold at bay. As January arrived with no break in the weather, Eleanor Thornfield faced the possibility that this might be her last winter in the mountains. The night the bear cub entered Eleanor's life arrived on the winds of the worst blizzard of that already brutal winter. The snowstorm had raged for 3 days straight, howling like a living creature as it battered the cabin. Eleanor had been forced to string rope from her back door to the woodshed just to navigate the blinding whiteness when she needed to retrieve more logs. On the fourth morning, the storm finally broke. The sudden silence woke Eleanor from her fitful sleep. She rose stiffly, joints protesting after days of huddling near the fireplace for warmth. The world outside her frosted windows was transformed into something alien and beautiful. Snow had drifted against the north side of her cabin nearly to the roof. The forest beyond was a collection of white sculptures, trees bent under their heavy burdens. Eleanor pulled on her heaviest coat and boots to check for damage to the property. The wind had torn loose one of her shutters, and a tree branch had fallen dangerously close to the chicken coop. She trudged through knee-high snow to secure what she could when a sound stopped her cold. At first, she thought it might be the wind returning, but the sky remained clear. The noise came again, a pitiful whimpering from behind the woodshed. Eleanor approached cautiously. In her decades in these mountains, she had learned that injured wild animals were among the most dangerous encounters possible. What she found was a tiny black bear cub, no more than a few months old, half buried in snow. Its fur was crusted with ice, its small body trembling violently. One of its paws appeared injured, preventing it from walking properly. The little creature looked up at her with eyes clouded by exhaustion and fear. Eleanor knew immediately that its mother must be dead. No bear mother would abandon her cub in such conditions unless something terrible had happened. Perhaps a hunter from the valley below, or a fall in the treacherous, icy conditions. Without its mother, the cub would certainly perish within hours. She stood motionless, considering her options. The sensible choice was to leave nature to its course. Wild animals were not pets, and bears especially were dangerous predators, even young ones. She had no business interfering with the natural order. Yet something in the cub's weakening cries pierced the practical shell Eleanor had built around her heart since Samuel's death. Before she could reconsider, she removed her scarf and carefully approached the frightened animal. It was so weak it barely struggled as she wrapped it securely and lifted it. The cub weighed surprisingly little, its small body burning with fever despite the cold. Inside the cabin, Eleanor created a makeshift bed from old blankets near the fire. She warmed goat's milk from her small herd and attempted to feed the cub with an old turkey baster. At first it refused to drink, turning its head away weakly. But hunger eventually overcame fear, and the tiny bear began to suckle at the improvised bottle. Eleanor stayed awake through the night, tending to the cub's injured paw and feeding it small amounts every few hours. She found herself speaking softly to it, words of encouragement she had not spoken aloud since caring for Samuel in his final illness. Just tonight, she told herself firmly, I will give it shelter for tonight and then find a way to contact the wildlife authorities. But as the cub finally fell into exhausted sleep, its small body curled trustingly against her leg, Eleanor Thornfield suspected she had just made a decision that would change everything. Weeks turned into months, and Eleanor's temporary care of the bear cub extended far beyond her initial intentions. She named him Samson, after the biblical figure of tremendous strength, though at first the name seemed almost comical for the weak, frightened creature that had entered her life. The spring thaw came late that year. By then, Samson had recovered from his injuries and grown strong enough that Eleanor knew she should contact authorities to relocate him to the wild. Each morning, she would tell herself today would be the day she made the journey to town. Each evening, she found a reason to postpone. What startled Eleanor most was Samson's rate of growth. She had expected a black bear cub to grow steadily, but Samson's development seemed almost accelerated. By summer's end, he was already the size of an adolescent bear, with a distinctive silver streak running down his otherwise black coat. His intelligence was equally remarkable. He learned quickly which areas of the cabin were off limits, how to open the simpler door latches, and even seemed to understand many of Eleanor's verbal commands. Their daily routine developed naturally. Mornings began with Eleanor preparing breakfast, while Samson waited patiently on the porch. After eating, they would walk the perimeter of her property, Samson lumbering alongside her with increasing confidence. During these walks, Eleanor found herself talking to the bear, as she once had to Samuel, sharing memories, concerns, even the occasional joke. The animal would tilt his head, his dark eyes fixed on her face, with an attentiveness that sometimes unnerved her. Afternoon saw them working together. Eleanor would tend her garden while Samson explored nearby, occasionally bringing her interesting finds like unusual stones or honeycomb. As he grew stronger, he began helping in his own way, pulling out tree stumps she had struggled with for years and carrying heavy loads of firewood that would have taken her multiple trips. By the second winter, Samson had grown to an astonishing size, far larger than any black bear Eleanor had ever seen or read about. His shoulders stood nearly level with her own when he walked on all fours, and when he occasionally rose to his hind legs, he towered over her by several feet. His paws were massive, capable of uprooting small trees, yet when he took berries from her hand, his touch was delicate, controlled. The protective nature of the bear manifested gradually. First, it was small things, like placing himself between Eleanor and a stranger who had wandered onto her property looking for directions. Then came the night a mountain lion screamed too close to the cabin. Before Eleanor could even reach for her rifle, Samson had burst through the door she had modified for him and disappeared into the darkness. The mountain lion's cries abruptly ceased, and Samson returned an hour later, unharmed but watchful, positioning himself at the foot of her bed until morning. Word spread through Blackwood Valley about the widow and her bear. The monthly trips to town for supplies became exercises in endurance as Eleanor weathered suspicious stares and whispered comments. Parents pulled children closer when she passed. The shopkeeper who had known her for decades now counted her money twice and placed her purchases on the counter rather than handing them directly to her. The local sheriff, Jenkins, finally confronted her outside the general store. He spoke of regulations regarding wild animals, of the dangers bears posed, of his duty to public safety. Eleanor listened silently, then simply asked if her bear had harmed anyone. When he admitted there had been no incidents, she nodded once and continued loading her supplies. As she drove her old truck back toward the mountains, Eleanor glanced in the rearview mirror at the cluster of townspeople watching her departure. For the first time in her life, she felt completely disconnected from humanity. Yet strangely, she was no longer lonely. Waiting for her at the cabin, watching from the tree line with those intelligent eyes, was Samson. Not human, certainly, but somehow family nonetheless. The years passed with a rhythm that brought unexpected contentment to Eleanor's life. Samson continued to grow until his size became truly extraordinary. By his fifth year with Eleanor, he stood over 9 feet tall when on his hind legs, weighing what she estimated must be close to 1,000 pounds. His chest and shoulders were broader than any bear documented in scientific literature, his strength nearly beyond comprehension. Yet despite his fearsome appearance, Samson's gentleness with Eleanor never wavered. He would delicately accept the honey cakes she baked as special treats, using just the tip of his massive claws to lift them from her palm. When she read in her rocking chair on summer evenings, he would settle his enormous bulk beside her, seemingly listening to the cadence of her voice as she shared passages from her favorite books. Their partnership evolved into a seamless collaboration. Samson learned to help with increasingly complex tasks around the property. He could roll large logs into position for splitting, hold items steady while she worked on repairs, and even seemed to understand which plants in her garden were ready for harvesting. During winter, he would clear paths through the snow with broad sweeps of his powerful forearms, making it possible for Eleanor to reach her outbuildings even during the heaviest snowfalls. Eleanor found herself studying Samson with growing curiosity. His behavior often defied what little she knew about wild bears. He rarely hibernated, sleeping more deeply during winter months, but never entering the months-long torpor typical of his species. He seemed capable of reasoning through simple problems, like figuring out how to retrieve objects that had fallen behind furniture or learning to recognize the different containers that held his favorite foods. As Eleanor entered her 80s, her body began the inevitable decline. Her hands, once strong enough to split logs and build fences, now trembled when she poured her morning tea. Her steps grew slower, less certain. Samson seemed to sense these changes, adjusting his pace during their walks, staying closer to her side on icy days, bringing fallen objects to her before she could attempt to retrieve them herself. On her 85th birthday, Eleanor suffered her first serious fall. Attempting to reach preserves on a high shelf, she lost her balance and crashed to the floor, her hip cracking audibly. The pain was blinding. She knew immediately the injury was severe, possibly fatal without medical attention. The nearest neighbor was miles away. The phone lines had been down for weeks due to storms, and she could not reach her truck. Samson found her gasping on the floor. The bear circled her anxiously, making distressed huffing sounds. Eleanor, fighting waves of pain, pointed weakly toward the emergency medical kit on a shelf. To her amazement, Samson rose to his hind legs, retrieved the kit, and placed it beside her. When she fumbled with the latches, unable to open it with her trembling hands, he used a single claw to flip it open for her. For 3 days, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness on her bed, where Samson had somehow managed to lift her without causing further injury. He brought her water, awkwardly carrying cups in his mouth without spilling them. He stayed beside her, his massive body providing warmth when fever chills racked her frame. When she was lucid enough to direct him, he brought her the painkillers and antibiotics from her medical supplies. On the 4th day, when Eleanor had grown strong enough to sit up, she placed her withered hand on Samson's broad head. "We are more alike than different, old friend," she whispered. "Both survivors, both alone until we found each other." Samson's eyes, deep and knowing, held hers with an intelligence that no longer surprised her. In that moment, Eleanor Thornfield accepted what she had perhaps known for years. This creature was not merely a pet, not merely a companion. What they shared transcended the natural order in ways she could not fully comprehend. Winter arrived early again in Eleanor's 90th year. The first snow fell in late September, dusting the mountains with white that glowed silver in the moonlight. Eleanor watched it from her bed, where she had spent increasingly more time as her strength continued to fade. Samson rarely left her side now, sensing the approaching end that Eleanor herself had come to accept with quiet dignity. Dr. Peterson from town had finally visited in the summer, overcoming his fear of Samson after Eleanor had paid a local boy handsomely to deliver an urgent message. The diagnosis confirmed what Eleanor already knew. Her heart was failing. The doctor had left medicines that eased her discomfort, but could not halt the inevitable. He had also left with wide eyes and breathless descriptions of Samson that spread through town like wildfire, reigniting fears and suspicions that had somewhat faded over the years. As October deepened, Eleanor used her remaining strength to put her affairs in order. She wrote letters, organized her few possessions, and spent long hours with her journal, writing frantically as if racing against time. Samson watched her with those intelligent eyes, occasionally bringing her dropped pencils or nudging her water glass closer when she seemed thirsty. On the morning of October 18th, Eleanor woke to unusual brightness. Opening her eyes, she saw that snow had fallen heavily overnight, transforming the world outside her window into a pristine white landscape that reminded her of the night she had found Samson. The bear lay on the floor beside her bed, his massive head resting on paws the size of dinner plates. He lifted his gaze to hers as she stirred. "It has been a good life, has it not?" Eleanor whispered, her voice thin but peaceful. Samson rose and moved closer, his warm breath gentle against her face. She lifted a trembling hand to the silver streak in his fur, now mirrored by her own silver hair. "You must continue without me now." Throughout the day, Eleanor drifted in and out of consciousness. When awake, she spoke to Samson of their years together, of Samuel, of the mountains she had loved all her life. As evening approached, her breathing grew more labored. Samson became increasingly agitated, pacing beside the bed before returning to press his head against her side, making soft sounds unlike any she had heard from him before. "Be wise," she told him in one final moment of clarity. "Be careful. They will not understand what you are." Eleanor Thornfield passed quietly in the night, with Samson curled around her bed, his enormous body providing warmth until the very end. 2 days later, Sheriff Jenkins and Dr. Peterson arrived for their promised check-in, concerned after not hearing from Eleanor for several weeks. What they found stopped them cold at the cabin door. Inside, Samson sat unmoving beside Eleanor's body, which he had somehow covered with her favorite quilt. The bear did not growl or threaten, but his posture made it clear that no one would approach her. The authorities retreated to discuss their unprecedented dilemma. Eleanor Thornfield needed to be properly laid to rest, but no one dared separate her from the massive bear that guarded her with unmistakable grief. Wildlife officials were called, tranquilizers prepared, and armed men positioned around the property. As word spread through Blackwood Valley about the standoff at the widow's cabin, even those who had feared and whispered about Eleanor for years felt a strange sense of loss. Whatever else she had been part of their mountains for nearly all their lives. Now only the bear remained, a living monument to the mystery that had been Eleanor Thornfield. The funeral for Eleanor Thornfield proceeded under tense circumstances. Wildlife officials had successfully tranquilized Samson after a tense standoff that lasted nearly 18 hours. The enormous bear had finally succumbed to multiple doses of sedatives, collapsing beside Eleanor's body with what witnesses would later describe as an almost human sound of anguish. They transported his unconscious form to a reinforced holding facility at the edge of the forest preserve, while Eleanor was laid to rest in the small cemetery adjoining the town church. Against the advice of wildlife experts, Sheriff Jenkins insisted Samson be released back into the wild rather than euthanized. The bear had never harmed anyone, he argued, and Eleanor would have wanted him free. 3 days after the funeral, officials transported the still groggy bear deep into the national forest, 50 miles from town, and released him with tracking collars designed for the largest known bears, though they had to be modified to fit his extraordinary size. By morning, the tracking signal had gone silent. The collar was found neatly severed, placed conspicuously on a rock near the release site. The search teams reported an unnerving feeling of being watched from the dense forest, though no trace of the giant bear could be found. Life in Blackwood Valley attempted to return to normal. The county sent workers to secure Eleanor's cabin and property while her minimal estate went through probate. No relatives came forward to claim her possessions. The workers reported strange occurrences during their task. Tools would disappear, only to be found neatly arranged at the edge of the property. The cabin door, locked securely each evening, would be found wide open in the morning. One worker swore he saw enormous paw prints in freshly poured concrete, though they mysteriously vanished before others could verify his claim. More disturbing phenomena began occurring throughout the valley. Hunters reported finding their traps sprung but empty, their hunting blinds systematically destroyed. Livestock behaved erratically, refusing to graze in certain areas without apparent reason. Children claimed to see a massive shadow moving through the forest at dusk, always watching, never approaching. In late November, 6 weeks after Eleanor's death, the region was hit by torrential rains that continued without pause for 5 days. The mountain soil, already saturated from early snowmelt, could absorb no more. Geological survey instruments began recording ominous movements in the old mining sector above town, but the warnings came too late. Shortly after midnight on November 30th, the northern slope above Blackwood Valley gave way. Millions of tons of rock, mud, and water began sliding toward the sleeping town below. The early warning sirens wailed, giving residents precious little time to evacuate. Families rushed from their homes in panic as the roar of the approaching landslide grew deafening. What happened next would be documented by dozens of witnesses, captured on cell phone videos, and still debated in scientific journals years later. The mud wall, 30 feet high and moving at devastating speed, was moments from hitting the first row of houses when an enormous dark shape emerged from the forest. Samson, impossibly larger than even those familiar with him remembered, positioned himself directly in the path of the slide. With a display of strength that defied biological possibility, he began digging, clawing, and physically redirecting the flow of debris away from the populated areas. Witnesses described how the bear seemed to anticipate the landslide's movements, working with deliberate strategy rather than animal instinct. He created channels that diverted the worst of the flow toward an unpopulated ravine, used fallen trees as makeshift barriers, and even appeared to be calculating load-bearing points in his constructed defenses. For 6 hours, while emergency services evacuated the town, Samson fought the mountain itself. His fur became caked with mud, his massive body showing wounds from the debris, Yet he continued with methodical precision. As dawn broke, the landslide finally stabilized. Where the town center should have been buried under 30 feet of mud and rock, only the outlying structures had sustained damage. Not a single human life was lost. Sheriff Jenkins, coordinating the evacuation from the high school gymnasium, stepped outside as the rain finally ceased. Standing at the edge of the devastation was Samson, his enormous frame silhouetted against the lightning sky. The bear turned toward the gathered crowd, now watching in stunned silence. With deliberate movements that sent gasps through the onlookers, Samson raised himself to his full height, towering nearly 10 feet tall. Then, in a motion no wild animal would ever make, he lifted one massive paw and deliberately pointed toward Eleanor's cabin in the distance, before dropping back to all fours and vanishing into the forest. "That thing," whispered Dr. Peterson, who stood trembling beside the sheriff. "That is no ordinary bear. What did she do up there all those years?" The question hung in the air as the stunned community of Blackwood Valley faced the undeniable truth that whatever bond had existed between Eleanor Thornfield and her bear had transcended anything they could understand, and it was far from over. After the landslide, Blackwood Valley became the center of national attention. News crews broadcast sensational stories about the hero bear, while scientists set up research stations hoping to document the extraordinary animal. Sheriff Jenkins, Dr. Peterson, and Mayor Collins returned to Eleanor's mysteriously undamaged cabin. They discovered a loose floorboard beneath her bed had been pried open, revealing a weathered journal and a metal box containing glass vials of amber liquid. The journal exposed a shocking truth. Eleanor Thornfield had once been Dr. Eleanor Winslow, a brilliant biochemist specializing in neural regeneration who was forced out of academia for her radical theories. She had continued her research in secret for decades. After finding the injured Samson as a cub, she had treated him with a serum derived from rare mountain fungi combined with synthesized proteins she had developed. The treatment not only healed his brain damage, but expanded his neural pathways, creating new connections that allowed for higher cognitive function. Her journal meticulously documented his extraordinary development, language comprehension, and eventual self-awareness. In her final entries, Eleanor revealed her greatest discovery. While studying Samson's transformation, she had identified a compound in his altered biochemistry that could fight prion diseases, including a dangerous variant spreading through deer populations that showed alarming potential to infect humans. Cases were already appearing in neighboring counties, misdiagnosed as rare forms of dementia. The last page contained coordinates and a simple message: Samson knows. He will show the way. Trust him. An expedition including Sheriff Jenkins, Dr. Peterson, and CDC scientists followed Eleanor's coordinates, guided deeper into the wilderness by conspicuous markers clearly left by Samson. Broken branches arranged as arrows, distinctive stones at trail junctions, and once, an enormous, deliberate paw print pointing the way. They discovered Eleanor's hidden laboratory behind a waterfall, immaculately preserved with refrigeration units powered by a small hydroelectric system she had engineered. Inside were cultures, samples, and complete documentation for a preventative treatment for the prion disease, along with enough synthesized compound to begin immediate testing. As they gathered the materials, Samson appeared at the cave entrance. The massive bear regarded them silently before deliberately placing Eleanor's wedding ring, which had been buried with her, on the ground between them. The message was unmistakable. Eleanor's legacy would continue not just through her scientific discoveries, but through the extraordinary consciousness she had awakened in Samson. He wasn't merely a bear with enhanced intelligence. He represented the first bridge between human understanding and the natural world, opening doors to communication with other species that would transform humanity's relationship with the planet itself. In the months that followed, Samson continued to make his presence known, sometimes leaving collected plant specimens with medicinal properties at the research stations. The prion treatment developed from Eleanor's research saved hundreds of lives across the region, while studies of Samson's cognitive abilities revolutionized understanding of animal intelligence, creating a whole new field of interspecies communication that Eleanor Thornfield had pioneered in her isolated mountain cabin. If you enjoyed this remarkable story of Eleanor and Samson, there are many more extraordinary tales waiting for you. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for weekly stories that will challenge your understanding of the world around us. Click the subscribe button below to join our community.